In the long annals of American folklore, buried somewhere between ghost stories whispered on porches and exaggerated tales told in taverns, lies a peculiar mystery that has puzzled historians, storytellers and researchers for more than a century and a half. The legend of the giant woman, reportedly hidden in Charleston in the year 1843. It is a tale seldom found in mainstream history textbooks. Instead, it sleeps quietly within forgotten newspaper clippings, scattered oral traditions, and the unending curiosity of those who seek the strange and unexplained. The story of the giant woman is not merely an odd anecdote, it is a window into the mindset of a particular era. The 1840s were a time of rapid change, expanding frontiers, scientific curiosity, and intense public fascination with the unusual. Tales of giants, strange creatures, and mysterious discoveries drifted across the United States like wildfire, capturing the imagination of a people who were navigating the edge between old-world superstition and new-world enlightenment. In this strange environment, a report about a hidden giant female figure in Charleston did not strike readers as entirely impossible. Instead, it was the sort of sensational detail that fit perfectly into the cultural atmosphere of the time. But what exactly was this story about? How did it begin? And why did it linger unresolved and unanswered long after countless other 19th-century tales faded into obscurity? The introduction to this mystery must begin by acknowledging that no single definitive account exists. Rather, what survives are fragments. Some versions describe the giant woman as a mummified body secretly kept in a Charleston warehouse. Others insist she was a living woman, towering far above ordinary height, who was sheltered or hidden away for reasons unknown. Still others treat the story as a kind of metaphorical or symbolic narrative, possibly exaggerating the truth for entertainment or political commentary. What is consistent, however, is that by the mid-19th century, people in Charleston and beyond were talking about something, or someone, of extraordinary size and equally extraordinary secrecy. This mystery cannot be separated from the social and cultural environment that produced it. In an age before modern photography was widespread, when newspapers relied heavily on sensationalism to sell issues, a single rumor could balloon into a phenomenon. People were far more likely to accept reports that today would be swiftly debunked. Curiosity ran unchecked, and with it came an appetite for stories of marvels, giants, ghosts, rare ethnographic specimens, and natural anomalies. Charleston in the 1840s was a bustling port city, steeped in commerce, culture, and conflict. Ships arrived from distant continents bringing goods, people, and stories. Dockworkers, sailors, travelers, entertainers, and merchants cross-pollinated the city with tales both true and fantastical. In such a place, a rumor about a hidden giant woman would find fertile ground. From there, the story could leap effortlessly from whispers in the marketplace to short newspaper columns, and eventually into the larger folklore of the region. The 1843 account of the giant woman is particularly compelling because it sits on the boundary between the possible and the impossible. On one hand, it could be dismissed as a fabrication, a hoax crafted by a bored journalist or an imaginative storyteller, but on the other hand, history is full of documented cases of individuals who far exceeded typical human height. The 19th century witnessed real giants, many of whom toured the country as part of circus and sideshow exhibitions. Some of these individuals reached confirmed heights over 7 feet tall, sometimes even 8. In this context, a report of an unusually tall woman, perhaps afflicted with gigantism or another medical condition, was within the realm of biological possibility. So if such individuals truly existed, why this particular woman have been hidden? Why the secrecy? Some folkloric versions of the story suggest she was hidden for protection, from exploitation, ridicule, or scientific examination. Others say she was hidden because her existence challenged social norms or frightened the local population. More mysterious accounts claim she may not have been entirely human, hinting at mythological origins or supernatural interpretations. Other theories assert that the tale was simply a product of the widespread 19th century fascination with giants, a fascination influenced by biblical references, archaeological misinterpretations, and a booming popular culture of oddities. An important part of understanding this mystery lies in examining how stories evolve. A small detail observed by one person becomes embellished by the next, and eventually the narrative becomes larger than life, just like the woman at its center. It is possible that the giant woman of Charleston began as an exaggeration, or even a misunderstanding. Perhaps someone saw a very tall woman passing through town. Perhaps someone discovered a large skeletal fragment and misattributed it to a human. Perhaps a showman brought a preserved body or figure to Charleston for exhibition. Any of these real events could have inspired the more fantastical versions of the tale, yet despite all of these theoretical explanations, the mystery remains unsolved because no definitive records confirm the story nor fully debunk it. What we have is the outline of a rumor, preserved through repetition, retelling, and reinterpretation. The survival of such a story speaks to something deeper about human curiosity. People are drawn to mysteries because they offer a taste of the unknown, a space where imagination is free to roam. The giant woman of Charleston is not just a question of historical fact, it is a testament to the way history and mythology intertwine. It invites modern readers to consider how information spreads, how communities react to the unusual, and how legends form around the smallest kernel of truth. Part of what makes this mystery so captivating is the way it invites speculation. Was the giant woman a real person? A hoax? A symbolic figure used to convey a deeper meaning? A misinterpreted artifact? Each explanation opens the door to new questions. If she was real, why hide her? If she was fabricated, who created the story and why did it persist? If she was a symbolic figure, what cultural anxieties or themes did she represent in 1843 Charleston? Even the language used in the old reports, phrases such as hidden away, towering figure, or unnatural size, adds a layer of Gothic atmosphere to the tale. It hints at secrecy, awe, and fear. It suggests something that either could not be explained or was not meant to be known. In the broader landscape of American mysteries, the giant woman occupies a unique space. She is not a ghost, a monster, or a criminal figure. She is instead a human anomaly, an extraordinary presence whose existence, if real, would challenge our understanding of normalcy and human limits. Stories of giants have existed in cultures around the world for millennia. From biblical giants like Goliath, to Norse Jotun, to Native American legends of giant tribes, humanity has always been fascinated by beings who exceed natural scale. The giant woman of Charleston, whether real or imagined, fits neatly into this global fascination. But perhaps the greatest power of this mystery lies in its incomplete nature. A fully explained story loses its magic, an unsolved one invites endless contemplation. Historians and folklorists often remark that some tales survive precisely because they cannot be fully verified. They hover in the liminal space between fact and fiction, drawing readers in with the promise of truth while preserving the allure of myth. The giant woman's story remains compelling not because of what is known, but because of what is unknown. Each generation Hat encounters the tale finds itself asking the same questions, drawn into the same puzzle. The story resurfaces periodically, like an archaeological artifact unearthed by new curiosity. Writers, researchers, and casual readers alike continue to revisit it, adding new interpretations while searching old records for clues. In some ways, the mystery serves as a cultural mirror. It reflects shifting attitudes toward science, sensationalism, human biology, and entertainment. It shows how stories once accepted at face value now demand evidence. It reveals how communities build collective memory, how legends evolve, and how history is shaped not only by facts but also by imagination. When examining the legend of the giant woman, one must also consider the role of secrecy itself. Secrecy gives power to a myth. A hidden figure is far more intriguing than a public one. If this woman had been openly displayed, photographed, or documented, she would likely be remembered as a historical curiosity, not a mystery. It is the idea that she was hidden, kept away intentionally, that fuels the enigma. Hidden things invite speculation. They provoke questions about motive. They inspire a sense of forbidden knowledge. What was so unusual about this woman that she had to be hidden? Was she hidden by choice or by force? Was she hidden because she was feared or because she was vulnerable? Was she hidden because the truth about her would upset social order? These unresolved questions elevate the story from a simple anomaly to a genuine mystery. As we begin the journey through the 8 parts of this topic, the introduction serves to remind us that the giant woman of Charleston is not just an isolated tale, it is part of a broader tapestry of human storytelling. It reminds us that history is not only preserved in books and archives, but also in whispers, rumors, and the collective imagination of communities. In the chapters to come, we will explore the historical context, the origins of the reports, the nature of the descriptions, and the many theories surrounding this strange case. But before diving into the details, one must appreciate the mystery as it stands, a blend of history, folklore, secrecy, and intrigue, suspended in time since 1843. And so, the tale begins, not with certainty, but with curiosity. Not with facts, but with possibilities. Not with clarity, but with the alluring fog of the unexplained. The giant woman remains a figure caught between worlds, between the known and the unknown, between the real and the mythical, between the documented and the imagined. It is this very ambiguity that makes her story enduring, and it is why we continue to seek her, even nearly 2 centuries after she first stepped, whether literally or figuratively, into Charleston's history. To understand the legend of the giant woman hidden in Charleston in 1843, we must first step back into the world that produced such a tale. The mystery cannot be separated from its environment. As explored in Part 1, the story survives as fragments, rumors, whispers, and scattered references, but those fragments make much more sense once we understand Charleston in the 1840s, a city whose culture, fears, aspirations, and daily rhythms created fertile soil for strange stories to take root and flourish. The Charleston of that era was not merely a backdrop, it was an active force shaping how people perceived unusual events, how newspapers amplified sensational information, and how society reacted to anything that blurred the line between the natural and the extraordinary. To explore this mystery deeply, we must immerse ourselves in the Charleston that existed almost 2 centuries ago, Charleston as a crossroads of worlds. During the 1840s, Charleston was one of the South's most important cities, economically, culturally, and politically. It was a bustling port where ships arrived from Europe, the Caribbean, South America, and the northern states. Each vessel carried more than cargo, it carried stories. Sailors told tales gathered across oceans. Merchants brought news from distant lands. Travelers carried rumors and legends with them, mixing fact and fiction like spices in the bustling markets and taverns. The city's role as a major trade hub meant it had constant exposure to the unfamiliar. Exotic animals, foreign goods, unusual artifacts, and traveling performers often passed through Charleston. In such an environment, reports of strange discoveries, whether real or fabricated, had a habit of spreading quickly and sticking firmly in the public imagination. In a place with such a steady flow of people and tales, the rumor of a giant woman would not be dismissed immediately. Instead, it would attract interest, speculation, and perhaps even fear. The cultural climate, suspense, curiosity, and sensationalism. By the 1840s, American newspapers were undergoing a transformation. The rise of the penny press, cheap, widely circulated papers, brought sensational stories into the hands of ordinary people. These papers thrived on tales of unusual creatures, scientific oddities, mysterious illnesses, freak accidents, ghosts and supernatural occurrences, extraordinary human beings. A story about a giant woman, especially one hidden from the public eye, was exactly the type of content editors loved. Even if based on rumor, a report could be printed quickly, with minimal fact-checking, often embellished along the way. Charleston's newspapers echoed this national trend. Articles were dramatic, often exaggerating ordinary events to draw attention. In this environment, the 1843 reports about the giant woman, however vague, fit seamlessly into the public appetite for the extraordinary. Scientific curiosity and the era of oddities. The early to mid-19th century was also a period of profound scientific curiosity. People were trying to understand human biology, fossils and ancient species, rare diseases, the boundaries of human height and strength, anthropology and the idea of exotic peoples, circus exhibitions, traveling freak shows, and scientific lectures often featured giants, dwarfs, conjoined twins, people with unusual medical conditions, mummified remains. These exhibitions were popular in port cities like Charleston, where diverse audiences passed through daily. Many were willing to pay to see the bizarre or to hear about wonders of the natural world. Thus, the concept of a giant did not seem impossible to people of the time. In fact, it seemed scientifically intriguing, even exciting. So when whispers emerged about an extraordinarily tall woman hidden somewhere in Charleston, people were primed to be curious. The idea resonated with both their fascination with science and their love of the bizarre, the social hierarchy, and the culture of secrecy. Charleston in the 1840s was also a city divided socially, economically, and racially. Its rigid class structure shaped how information circulated and who had access to it. Wealthy families controlled political and economic life. Workers and sailors passed news informally in taverns and docks. Enslaved people carried private knowledge, stories, and observations that often remained undocumented. The culture of secrecy was real and deeply embedded. Many things were deliberately concealed from the public eye: controversial events, personal scandals, and socially unacceptable situations. In such a context, the idea of someone being hidden, particularly someone unusual, was not outlandish. Whether the woman was supposedly hidden because she was extraordinary, dangerous, valuable, or vulnerable, the story aligned with Charleston's culture of private affairs and concealed truths. This secrecy added power to the legend. A giant woman openly displayed might have seemed like a spectacle, but a giant woman hidden behind the closed doors of a warehouse or mansion, that suggested something far stranger: religious beliefs and the fear of the uncanny. Religion played a central role in Charleston's culture. The Bible, with its references to giants like Goliath and the Nephilim, gave people a framework through which to interpret reports of unusually tall individuals. Some believed giants were remnants of ancient civilizations. Others thought they were signs of divine mysteries, or even moral warnings. In a deeply religious society, the idea of a giant woman might provoke awe, fear, superstitious interpretations, moral debates, questions about divine purpose. The supernatural and the biblical were often woven into everyday life, shaping how people reacted to remarkable events. Thus, the legend of the giant woman intersected with theological curiosity. Was she a medical anomaly, a divine sign, a descendant of biblical giants, or merely a hoax that gained credibility because people were predisposed to believe such things? Local legends and the Southern storytelling tradition. Charleston, like much of the American South, had a rich tradition of storytelling. Tales of ghosts, monsters, unusual discoveries, and mysterious figures often blended with historical events to create narratives that were both entertaining and cultural. Storytelling served many purposes: preserving history, teaching moral lessons, providing entertainment, making sense of the unfamiliar, exaggerating real events into mythic proportions. It is very possible that the legend of the giant woman began as a small observation, a rumor about a tall visitor or an unusual skeleton, and grew through repeated retelling. Each storyteller added a detail. She was hidden, she was enormous, she wasn't natural, she was kept secret. In this way, Charleston's storytelling culture helped amplify and sustain the tale. The medical landscape, limited knowledge, high curiosity. The 1840s were also a period when medical knowledge was expanding but still limited. Conditions like gigantism and acromegaly were not yet well understood. Doctors knew that some individuals grew far taller than average, but they had little knowledge of the causes. As a result, extraordinarily tall individuals were often treated with curiosity, suspicion, scientific interest, exploitation. Medical colleges sometimes displayed unusual bodies. Traveling physicians exhibited preserved specimens. Surgeons sought access to unique cases for research. If the giant woman was rumored to be kept hidden, one possible reason could be to protect her from exploitation, or, alternatively, to exploit her discreetly. Either scenario fits the era. Charleston's warehouses and hidden spaces. Charleston contained a labyrinth of warehouses, storage facilities, shipping yards, private estates, old basements and cellars. These locations were perfect settings for whispered rumors. Storage areas near the port often held strange items temporarily, imported artifacts, medical specimens, and cargo from around the world. It is not difficult to imagine how a single unusual shape or object could spark dramatic interpretations. Something huge is inside that warehouse. I saw a body. It's a woman, and she's enormous. Even if the truth was mundane, the setting allowed the rumor to grow: race, power, and the fear of the unknown. The social tensions of the 1840s also shaped how unusual stories spread. Charleston was a city with complex racial dynamics, operating under slavery and strict social control. People lived with constant anxiety about maintaining order and authority. In such an environment, any story involving an extraordinary figure, especially one outside the norms of physical appearance, could become entangled with fears, stereotypes, or moral warnings used by different groups for different purposes. A tale of a giant woman could be interpreted as a story of difference, as a warning of divine judgment, as a sign of unnatural change, as a spectacle of human variation. The social environment provided multiple avenues for the story to take on symbolic meaning beyond its literal form: traveling exhibitions and public fascination with giants. Circuses and oddity exhibitions visited Charleston frequently. These shows often advertised giants, whether real or exaggerated. Posters throughout the city promised the tallest man on earth, a woman of unnatural size, marvels from across the globe. Crowds were already accustomed to the idea of humans who were larger than life. This familiarity made it easier for the public to accept rumors about a giant woman living or hidden in their own city. A real exhibited giant could have inspired the story. A visiting performer might have been misunderstood or sensationalized, or a showman could have planted the rumor to attract curiosity. Charleston, with its lively entertainment scene, was the perfect environment for such a tale to thrive, newspapers feeding the flames. It is likely that the earliest mentions of the giant woman story came from newspapers or pamphlets published in or around Charleston in the early 1840s. These papers often used dramatic language to captivate readers. Headlines such as, "Astonishing Discovery in Charleston, a woman of gigantic proportions found," "Strange Body Hidden, City Whispers." Even if published only once, such a headline could echo for decades through retelling. Newspapers amplified stories rapidly, and as Part 1 outlined, they often blurred the line between truth and fiction. A rumor could become a widely believed fact simply through repetition, connecting back to Part 1, why this preface matters. Part 1 introduced the mystery, a giant woman said to be hidden in Charleston in 1843, a story blending fact and folklore, secrecy and sensationalism. But understanding the city's background is crucial to interpreting the story's significance. Everything about Charleston in the 1840s, the port activity, the storytelling culture, the limited medical knowledge, the sensationalist newspapers, the social hierarchies, and the fascination with the extraordinary made it the perfect place for such a mystery to be born and preserved. Without understanding the environment, the tale might seem implausible. But when viewed within the context of Charleston's culture and historical atmosphere, the legend appears not only possible, but almost inevitable. It is exactly the kind of story that would flourish in a city like Charleston at a time like 1843. Just as Part 1 emphasized, the giant woman remains a mystery not because of clear evidence, but because of the fertile imagination of the society that witnessed or invented her. Charleston's background provides the stage, the mood, and the psychological environment that shaped this tale into a long-lasting legend. The first known mention of the giant woman in 1843 did not come as a well-preserved report or a detailed document, but rather as a whisper carried through Charleston's bustling streets, a whisper that slowly grew into a story large enough to echo through the generations. The origins of the tale are as elusive as the woman herself. Some say it began with a short line buried in a local newspaper. Others insist it came from a sailor who claimed to have seen something extraordinary stored in one of the port's warehouses. A few believe the story began in private circles, spoken quietly among the wealthy or those who worked behind the scenes in Charleston's storage yards. Like so many mysteries of the 19th century, the first report appeared not as a declaration, but as a rumor, a murmur, an uncertain claim that invited curiosity rather than offered clarity. To understand how this first report was received, one must recall the Charleston described in the previous part, a city overflowing with gossip, trade, exotic arrivals, and an insatiable appetite for the extraordinary. In such a place, a single strange observation could ignite the imagination of thousands, and so it was when someone, somewhere, suggested that a woman of giant-like proportions had been discovered or brought into the city under circumstances both mysterious and unsettling. The phrasing varied between accounts. Some said she had been found, others that she had been brought, still others that she had been stored or hidden. But no matter which version one heard, the central claim was the same: there existed, within Charleston's boundaries, a woman of impossible size, whether alive or dead, being kept from public view. The earliest printed reference that researchers later traced to 1843 was hardly more than a paragraph, tucked between advertisements for imported goods and announcements about ship arrivals. Newspapers of that time often published oddities without explanation, hoping that such curiosities would increase readership. The article, if it could be called that, described a female figure of remarkable stature, reportedly seen in a private warehouse near the docks. It offered no name, no measurements, no photographs. Of course, photography was still in its infancy, but the phrasing was evocative enough to ignite public interest. The mysterious woman was described as quite beyond ordinary size and kept from public view for reasons unstated. These vague descriptions, combined with the era's tendency to sensationalize unusual claims, were enough to make people wonder. Once the small printed note appeared, the story began to travel much faster. People interpreted the lack of detail not as a sign of fabrication, but as evidence of secrecy. A lack of clarity was, in the minds of many, confirmation that something unusual was being concealed, and so the tale spread from the newspaper's typeset lines into the spoken networks of sailors at taverns, merchants at the docks, and families gathered around dinner tables. Charleston's social structure ensured that the rumor moved through different layers of the population, each altering it slightly in retelling, just as described in the city's background. Dock workers might describe having seen a crate large enough to fit a giant. Wealthy residents might claim they heard the woman came from a foreign ship. Enslaved workers, deeply connected to the city's hidden spaces and private homes, might whisper that they had glimpsed her or heard their owners discussing her in hushed tones. The question of precisely who witnessed the figure, or whether anyone had, remains part of the mystery. Some Charleston residents claimed they saw a tall silhouette behind a warehouse window late at night. Others insisted they saw a massive figure covered in cloth being carried by several men. Still others swore they heard heavy footsteps echoing through storage halls long after closing hours. These reports cannot be verified, and taken individually, each could be explained by ordinary events. But collectively, they created a web of suggestive details, a patchwork of impressions that fed into the growing legend. Sailors, in particular, added dramatic embellishments. Seafarers were famous for exaggeration, and Charleston's port teemed with them. A sailor might claim the giant woman was discovered aboard a ship traveling from South America, preserved as a curiosity. Another might say she was a living woman, rescued from an island populated by unusually tall people. Yet another might claim she was being transported to a circus, but had been intercepted in Charleston. These stories were often inspired by the real curry, oddities that traveled through ports at the time: strange animals, rare fossils, preserved specimens, or unusually tall human performers. In an era where fact and fiction were constantly blending, it wasn't difficult for listeners to believe that something equally extraordinary could arrive in their own city. The mystery deepened as more people tried to locate where the giant woman was supposedly kept. A few locations were repeatedly mentioned in rumors: a warehouse near the main docks, a storage building owned by a well-known merchant family, or a secluded estate on the city's outskirts. Each location had qualities that suited the story. Warehouses were filled with tall crates and unusual cargo, the perfect environment for something to be hidden. Merchant buildings often held private rooms or locked chambers. Large estates sometimes contained cellars, storage rooms, or unused structures that could spark the imagination. Even if none of these places actually held a giant woman, each place had enough shadow and secrecy to inspire speculation. Newspapers outside Charleston also picked up the story, though their brief mentions varied wildly in accuracy. Some simply repeated the original vague report, while others rewrote it into something more sensational, claiming the woman stood 8 or 9 feet tall, or that she weighed an impossible amount, or that she was kept locked behind iron doors. The lack of consistency in these accounts only fueled the mystery further. People did not know which version to believe, and the contradictions created room for even more speculation. In the minds of the public, any detail could be true, and none could be disproven. Doctors and scientists in Charleston also heard about the rumor. The 1840s were, as mentioned earlier, an era of intense scientific curiosity, especially regarding human anatomy and unusual physiological conditions. A report of a giant woman, if true, would have been of great interest to medical professionals. Some later accounts claim a physician tried to investigate but was turned away by the owners of the building where the woman was supposedly kept. Whether this ever happened is unknown, but the very existence of such claims helped reinforce the idea that someone was intentionally hiding her, perhaps to avoid public attention or scientific intrusion. This idea of concealment became central to the mystery. If the woman truly existed, then the secrecy needed an explanation. People speculated endlessly. Perhaps she was too fragile to be displayed publicly, or perhaps she was considered too shocking for polite company. Perhaps she was being exploited privately, or perhaps she was being protected. Some believed she might have been part of a traveling show that passed through the city, and that she had fallen ill or died, forcing the showman to hide her temporarily. Others believed she had been found locally, maybe in a remote area or buried somewhere nearby, and brought to Charleston for examination or sale. There were even stories that she had been found in a collapsed burial mound or dug up accidentally by construction workers who recognized her unusual size. Some versions of the first report described the woman as alive, others as a preserved figure, and still others as skeletal remains. These variations mirror the confusion and fascination present in Charleston at the time. If people believed she was alive, they imagined her being fed and cared for in secrecy, perhaps unable to move freely due to her size. If they believed she was a preserved body, they envisioned her as an archaeological or anthropological marvel, possibly connected to ancient giants mentioned in folklore. If they thought she was skeletal, they imagined her as evidence of a long-lost race of large people. Possibility carried its own implications, and none could be dismissed easily in an age when scientific understanding was still developing. The first report's vagueness played directly into Charleston. ON's cultural dynamics. As described in Part 2, the city was primed for such a story. The port's diversity made residents open to unusual tales. The rigid, social hierarchy meant secrets were common. The tradition of storytelling amplified unusual events into folklore, and the medical curiosity of the time created a framework for interpreting the story as something potentially scientifically significant. All these elements worked together to give the first report of the giant woman a kind of gravitational pull. The story did not fade quickly, as many rumors did. Instead, it clung to the public imagination, refusing to vanish despite the absence of tangible evidence. In fact, the lack of evidence may have strengthened the legend. People were more willing to believe something was being hidden than to accept that nothing unusual had happened. The year 1843 became forever linked to the mystery because that was when the first known mention occurred, even though the story likely circulated orally before and after that precise date. Throughout the rest of the decade, the rumor resurfaced periodically. Some individuals claimed to possess secret knowledge. Others said they knew someone who had seen the woman. Stories multiplied, each adjusting details to fit the storyteller's perspective or agendas. What began as a short mention in a newspaper transformed into a tale with many layers, each reflecting Charleston's unique mixture of curiosity, secrecy, and storytelling tradition. In connecting back to the earlier parts, it becomes clear why this first report became significant. Part 1 introduced the mystery as a blend of myth and uncertain history. Part 2 showed how Charleston's environment nurtured such stories. Part 3 now demonstrates how the actual spark, this vague, ambiguous report, landed on ground already soaked in imagination. The city's culture acted like tinder, and the rumor was the flame. From that moment, the story could never again be contained. It grew, spread, and rooted itself in the city's folklore, eventually becoming the enduring legend that still captures our attention today. If the earliest reports of the giant woman in 1843 were unclear and fragmentary, the descriptions that followed were even more tangled, drifting between reality and imagination, each shaped by the era's fascination with the extraordinary and its appetite for speculation. As the rumor spread through Charleston, through its docks, taverns, markets, and parlors, people began to fill in the missing details. In the absence of verified facts, imagination stepped forward to do the work. And so, what people described when they spoke of the giant woman varied widely, yet always carried the sense of something remarkable, unsettling, and deeply mysterious. These descriptions became the heart of the legend, giving shape to the figure who lived mostly in whispers and speculation. The earliest descriptions that circulated after the first report were simple. She was large, unusually tall, of proportions beyond common measure. But in Charleston, where the city's visual landscape was crowded with unusual cargo and strange arrivals, such vague phrases were quick to transform into elaborate portraits. Some claimed she stood over 8 feet tall, her head brushing the rafters of the warehouse in which she was supposedly kept. Others insisted she was closer to 10 feet, a height far beyond known medical conditions, pushing the story into the realm of myth or exaggeration. A few more conservative descriptions placed her at 7 feet or slightly above it, which, while still extraordinary, was biologically plausible. These, of course, were only numbers, guesses, estimates, or inventions, but they shaped the public imagination in powerful ways. People who tried to visualize her based on these descriptions painted very different pictures. Some imagined her as a robust, muscular figure, built like a towering sentinel. Others pictured her as slender and elongated, almost fragile despite her height. A few accounts described her as perfectly proportioned, only on a much larger scale, like a statue of a goddess brought to life. Others claimed her limbs were unusually long, her fingers slender and almost delicate, giving her an ethereal, otherworldly appearance. Still others insisted she must have suffered from a medical condition, her features distorted or exaggerated, her movements labored. The contradictions revealed more about the storytellers than about the woman herself, reflecting their own biases, fears, and sense of wonder. Her face, too, became the subject of countless speculations. Some said she had a calm, almost serene expression, as though she were unaware of the commotion she caused. Others described her face as haunting, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, suggesting illness or suffering. A few rumors claimed her features were strikingly beautiful, so beautiful, in fact, that they added to the mystery of why she was kept hidden. Others claimed her appearance was unnerving, with proportions that deviated just enough from the norm to inspire unease. Beauty and fear, grace and monstrosity, divinity and deformity, every storyteller chose a different angle, and each angle contributed to the legend's endurance. Clothing was another point of divergence, revealing how little people actually knew. Some claimed she wore simple garments, perhaps hastily made or ill-fitting due to her unusual size. Others insisted she was wrapped in cloth or canvas, suggesting she was being transported, preserved, or concealed intentionally. A few stories described her wearing fine garments, the kind associated with European nobility or exotic cultures, as though she had come from a distant land. These fanciful details often reflected Charleston's diverse port culture, where global influences mingled freely with local imagination. The idea that she was foreign, perhaps from a land inhabited by unusually tall people, appealed to a society fascinated by the exotic. The question of whether she was alive or dead became central to the legend. Many believed she was alive, kept hidden in a dark room or storage cellar where only a few caretakers tended to her. Those who believed this often emphasized her vulnerability. She could not move easily, or she was too large to navigate the city's narrow streets, or she was ill and required constant attention. Others believed she was dangerous, her size making her a potential threat, and therefore her seclusion was necessary for public safety. These interpretations aligned with Charleston's social climate, where notions of order, control, and secrecy were deeply embedded. On the other hand, many believed she was dead, a preserved specimen, a mummified body, or a skeletal relic discovered in some distant excavation and shipped to Charleston for study or exhibition. These interpretations reflected the era's scientific interests. The 19th century was full of accounts of preserved giants or unusual artifacts allegedly unearthed in remote regions. If the giant woman was thought to be preserved, her presence in a warehouse made perfect sense. Such items were often stored before exhibition or sale, and many of them passed through port cities like Charleston. Some versions suggested she was a fossil or skeletal remain, a relic of a long-lost civilization. These ideas intertwined with biblical interpretations and ancient mythology, which frequently referenced giants. In this context, the giant woman became a kind of archaeological marvel, a symbol of the past reaching into the present. In some accounts, her skin was described as darkened, dried, or leathery, consistent with mummification techniques or natural preservation. Other accounts insisted her skin was pale, almost ghostly, adding an eerie aura to the story. A few more imaginative storytellers described her skin as unusually smooth or elastic, suggesting she was not human in the ordinary sense. These descriptions, though fantastical, reflect the era's fascination with unusual human conditions and preserved remains, and they parallel reports of mummies and specimens exhibited in traveling shows. Rumors about her origins further shaped her description. If she was said to have come from a distant country, people imagined her in exotic terms. If she was said to have been found locally, perhaps unearthed from a burial mound or discovered in a swamp, her appearance took on a more eerie, ancient quality. Those who believed she arrived by ship often described her as wrapped tightly in bandages or cloth, consistent with cargo transported long distances. Those who believed she was found alive described her movements, her breathing, or even the sound of her voice, although such details were always second-hand, coming from someone who knew someone who had supposedly seen her. The descriptions did not stop at physical appearance. People also speculated about her behavior. Some claimed she was gentle, quiet, and compliant, giving the impression of a peaceful being whose only unusual trait was her size. Others described her as restless or fearful, as though she did not understand where she was or why she was hidden. A few claimed she had moments of great strength, so strong that she could lift items no ordinary person could manage. These claims mirrored the exaggerations common in circus advertisements, where giants were portrayed as possessing superhuman ability. There were also darker descriptions. Some claimed she was aggressive or unpredictable, that she had to be restrained or sedated. These stories likely came from the era's fear of anything outside the norm. People often interpreted unusual behavior through a lens of danger. If she was alive and hidden, some would conclude she was being kept away from the public because she posed a threat. If she was dead, some would conclude she had been dangerous in life. Fear filled the gaps where knowledge was absent. Her age, too, was the subject of speculation. Some believed she was young, perhaps in her 20s, her features suggesting the prime of life. Others believed she was older, with lines of age etched into her massive face. A few claimed she was ancient, her appearance so strange that she must have lived long ago. These interpretations reflected not only imagination, but also the lack of any factual basis. People simply filled in the details according to their own narrative preferences. The contradictions in her description reveal an important point: no one truly knew what she looked like. As described in Part 3, the first report was vague, and no verified witnesses emerged. The descriptions that followed were constructions, combinations of cultural expectations, personal fears, scientific curiosities, and the natural human tendency to embellish. Charleston was full of storytellers, and each storyteller shaped the giant woman into a figure that suited their version of events. The legend's persistence can be traced to these evolving descriptions. A vague, simple rumor might have faded, but a rumor that grew richer and more detailed with each retelling became difficult to dismiss. Over time, the giant woman transformed from a shadowy figure into a character of legend. She became a symbol, a representation of the unknown forces that moved through Charleston's bustling port, its secretive warehouses, and its restless imagination. These descriptions also connect directly back to the environment described in Part 2. In a city overflowing with imported goods, exotic travelers, and unusual performers, the idea of a giant woman, whether living or dead, felt plausible enough to gain traction. And because Charleston's culture embraced secrecy, the idea of her being hidden made the legend even more powerful. By the time the story settled into the city's folklore, the giant woman had been imagined in so many different ways that she no longer needed a single consistent description. She existed as a mosaic of interpretations, each reflecting a different aspect of the city's character. In this way, Part 4's exploration of the descriptions becomes more than a catalogue of physical traits. It becomes a study of how Charleston itself shaped the legend. The giant woman's appearance was not recorded, it was created, piece by piece, through the minds of those who heard the rumor and retold it. Her image became a mirror that reflected the anxieties, curiosities, and creative impulses of the people of 1840s Charleston. Whether described as beautiful or frightening, fragile or powerful, ancient or alive, she remained the embodiment of the unknown, a figure too large both physically and symbolically to fade from memory. If the descriptions of the giant woman were already clouded by contradictions and emotional exaggeration, the question of where such a story originated became even more tangled. After all, myths do not appear without cause. Even the most unbelievable legends are rooted somewhere in human experience, whether in misunderstanding, fear, or intentional deception. The Charleston tale was no different. As the reports spread and people tried to make sense of the strange figure described in the newspapers and whispered about in the streets, a number of theories emerged. Some were practical, some were fantastical, and others were crafted by those who understood how easily the public could be swayed by mystery. These theories formed the foundation for what later generations would call the unsolved origins of the giant woman legend. One of the earliest explanations suggested that the story may have grown out of a simple misinterpretation, a real woman of exceptional height, perhaps traveling through Charleston, whose appearance startled onlookers unaccustomed to seeing someone so tall. It is easy to imagine how, in a city where word-of-mouth communication was still dominant, and newspapers were constantly seeking dramatic material, the sight of such a person could become magnified. A woman standing over 6 feet tall in the 1840s would have been a rarity, and by the time rumors passed from one observer to the next, her height might have stretched from unusual to extraordinary. A person saying she must have been nearly 7 feet tall could soon be quoted as having seen a woman well over 7 feet, and within days she might be described as a giant. Ordinary details dissolve quickly when filtered through fear, excitement, and the desire to share a sensational story. Others believe the accounts had roots in the world of traveling shows and exhibitions, which were common in the 19th century. At the time, circuses and sideshow troupes frequently visited the port cities of the American South, advertising displays of unusual bodies to paying crowds, bearded ladies, wild men, conjoined twins, and exceptionally tall individuals who were promoted under extravagant titles like the tallest woman on earth or the Amazon Queen. These exhibitions often used aggressive marketing tactics, exaggerating or completely fabricating details in order to draw crowds. A show operator might claim a performer was 8 feet tall even if she was barely 6.5. If a circus passed through Charleston around the time of the 1843 reports, and there is some evidence that small traveling troupes were indeed in the region, its advertisements or performers could have fed directly into the imagination of local people. Once the story began circulating, the circus influence would fade into the background, leaving only the legend without its commercial roots. Another theory suggests that the giant woman was never meant to be taken as a literal physical being at all. Instead, she may have originated as a metaphor or symbolic figure used by satirists or commentators in the press. Charleston newspapers of the time were known to publish humorous or exaggerated pieces under fictitious names, often poking fun at political issues or social tensions. Writers sometimes created imaginary characters to represent moral warnings or to critique local events. It is entirely possible that the first mention of the giant woman was intended as a piece of satire or commentary, meant to draw attention to something indirectly. Perhaps the writer used the image of an enormous woman, emerging from obscurity to criticize corruption, economic growth, or even the influx of outsiders into the city. Over time, however, readers might have forgotten the original context and retold the story as if it were a factual report. This transformation from satire into supposed eyewitness testimony has happened countless times throughout history, and Charleston, with its vibrant storytelling culture, would have been especially vulnerable to it. The folklore explanation also gained ground as the story matured. The American South in the mid-1800s was rich with oral traditions, many of which blended African, Caribbean, Native American, and European influences. Tales of giants existed in nearly every one of these cultural streams. Some Native American tribes told stories of enormous ancient beings who shaped the land or protected sacred spaces. Folklore brought over by enslaved Africans included accounts of giants who guarded hidden treasure or punished those who broke spiritual rules. European immigrants carried with them legends of towering female spirits, often associated with abandoned houses or forgotten graves. If even fragments of these traditions were circulating in Charleston's diverse population, then the idea of a giant woman might have tapped into deep-rooted cultural memory. When such a legend meets a moment of collective uncertainty or heightened imagination, it can burst into the public consciousness with unexpected power. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. People often create extraordinary explanations to fill gaps in understanding. In 1843, Charleston was a city experiencing tension, socially, economically, and culturally. Disease outbreaks were common, political factions clashed, and the city's identity was shifting as immigration increased and old structures weakened. In such environments, strange stories take on extra momentum. A single unusual sighting becomes symbolic, amplified by collective unease. People see what they expect to see or what they fear to see. The giant woman may have been a projection of these anxieties, an embodiment of the unknown looming over the city. Fear often needs a shape, and once that shape forms, it spreads. There were also those who believed the story was a deliberate hoax, crafted for entertainment or profit. Newspapers competed intensely for readership and frequently published sensational stories without verifying them. A dramatic tale of a mysterious giant woman hidden somewhere in Charleston would have guaranteed sales. Once a newspaper printed an extraordinary claim, rival papers might echo it, either to mock it or to capitalize on the excitement. Hoaxes were not uncommon in this era. In fact, just a few years earlier, the famous Great Moon Hoax convinced thousands of people that telescopes had discovered winged humans and colossal animals living on the moon. Against such a backdrop, believing in a giant woman hiding in Charleston was not so far-fetched. The idea that editors might have invented the entire tale simply to outdo their competitors remains one of the most plausible explanations. Another possibility connects the legend to practices involving the display of preserved human bodies, a controversial but surprisingly common phenomenon in the 19th century. Museums, curiosity shops, and even some medical institutions displayed mummies or unusually large skeletons, sometimes claiming they were relics of ancient giants or mythical beings. If a particularly tall skeleton or an oddly proportioned preserved body was brought to Charleston, intentionally or accidentally, it could have inspired the story. Witnesses unfamiliar with the scientific explanations might have interpreted what they saw as proof of a giant woman, especially if the remains were kept partially hidden or only shown selectively. As rumors spread, details could have been altered or embellished, transforming a preserved specimen into a living or recently discovered figure. Some accounts also hinted at an even stranger possibility, that the giant woman was linked to the sea. Charleston, being a port city, often received ships arriving from distant lands, carrying cargo, sailors, stories, and sometimes human oddities. Sailors were notorious for their dramatic storytelling, and tales of sea giants, especially female ones, were part of maritime folklore in many cultures. If a ship arrived with an unusually tall passenger, a sickly woman whose body appeared elongated by disease, or even a large carved figurehead depicting a female form, people unfamiliar with maritime traditions might easily misunderstand what they were seeing. In a time when superstition intertwined with daily life, It would not take much for such a misunderstanding to ignite speculation. The mental picture of a towering woman emerging from a ship's shadows might have stuck in the imagination, growing more vivid with each retelling. The possibility of intentional misinformation cannot be discounted either. Individuals or groups might have spread the story to distract the public, influence opinion, or manipulate certain events. Charleston in the 1840s was politically charged, shaped by debates over trade, morality, and social order. A fantastical story could divert attention from more serious issues or create an atmosphere of uncertainty that benefited certain factions. Even if this theory seems unlikely today, the political climate of the time makes it worth considering. When truth becomes malleable and stories move faster than evidence, myths can become tools in the hands of the influential. As each theory accumulated, contradictions intensified rather than resolved. Some people swore the woman was real and claimed to have seen her. Others insisted the entire tale was invented. Still others observed that believing or rejecting the story said more about a person's temperament than about the tale itself. For many, the origin of the giant woman became a vessel into which they poured their fears, hopes, and curiosities. The story took on a life of its own precisely because it could be interpreted in so many ways. It was a mystery, and mysteries thrive when answers remain just out of reach. Over time, the theories hardened into folklore, even as evidence remained elusive. No single explanation fully satisfied the public. The misinterpretation theory explained some aspects, but not the secrecy implied in the reports. The circus theory aligned with the sensational tone, but did not clarify the more dramatic descriptions. The satire theory accounted for inconsistencies, but failed to explain why so many readers believed the story. The preserved body explanation matched some accounts of the woman's stillness, but did not address claims of movement. The maritime theory fit the atmosphere of a port city yet lacked concrete documentation. And the hoax theory, while plausible, could not alone explain why the story persisted long after any profit motive had disappeared. What made the myth endure was not the strength of any single explanation, but the peculiar way they blended together, each filling a different gap. The giant woman became a composite figure, part misinterpretation, part superstition, part deception, part folklore. Her origin was not one spark, but many small sparks that ignited simultaneously. The story was compelling because it never offered a clear boundary between the possible and the impossible. It blurred the line between truth and imagination, reflecting the uncertainties of a city in transition. As the years passed, people continued to speculate, and each retelling pushed the mystery further from its roots. The original causes, whatever they were, faded behind layers of myth, until eventually even the earliest newspapers became secondary to the legend itself. The giant woman transformed from a curiosity of 1843 into a symbol of Charleston's rich and unpredictable history, a reminder that some stories resist resolution, not because evidence is lacking, but because the mystery itself becomes more powerful than any explanation could be. As the various theories about the origins of the giant woman legend continued to circulate, misinterpretations, circus exaggerations, satire, preserved bodies, maritime misunderstandings, and deliberate hoaxes, Charleston found itself caught between fascination and skepticism. By the mid-1840s, the story had become so widespread that it was no longer enough for people simply to speculate. Curiosity hardened into intention, and intention transformed into action. People wanted proof. They wanted answers. They wanted to know whether the whispers carried any truth, or whether they had merely allowed themselves to be swept into the tide of a collective dream. This desire for certainty is what sparked the first attempts to investigate the mystery, efforts that would become as much a part of the legend as the woman herself. Most early investigations were informal and spontaneous, initiated not by officials or scholars, but by ordinary citizens. Dock workers, merchants, journalists, sailors, and even travelers who had heard the tale in passing. Some had been drawn in by curiosity, others felt a sense of duty to expose what they believed was the truth behind a dangerous or misleading rumor. Still others simply saw an opportunity to attach themselves to a mystery that everyone in the region was talking about. In each case, their pursuit added new layers of interpretation to the story, further complicating the already tangled web of theories. One of the earliest documented attempts involved a small group of young men who, inspired by the circulating claims that the giant woman had been seen near the wharves, decided to search the shipping district after sunset. According to later accounts, they carried lanterns and sticks, imagining that they might encounter something monstrous lurking behind crates or inside abandoned storage rooms. Of course, they found nothing except startled rats and the faint smell of stagnant seawater. Yet one member of the group insisted he saw a large shadow move across a boarded warehouse window, and though the others dismissed it, his claim made its way into the newspapers as a possible sighting, reigniting public interest. This was the first clear example of how investigations, rather than resolving the mystery, sometimes intensified it by creating new rumors. Journalists soon began to take a more direct role. At least 2 local papers reportedly sent their own staff members to interview residents who claimed to have witnessed the giant woman. But these interviews produced contradictions even more pronounced than the original reports. Some interviewees insisted the woman was taller than any known person, while others claimed she was simply large-boned. Some said she wore a long, tattered dress, others described her wrapped in a kind of shroud or cloth. A few said she walked with difficulty, while others swore she moved with eerie silence. The inconsistencies made it difficult for journalists to construct a coherent narrative, but they also heightened the public's sense that something strange had indeed occurred, that the witnesses' inability to agree was itself a sign of an unsettling truth just outside their grasp. As amateur investigations proved inconclusive, more organized efforts emerged. A small circle of local historians and intellectuals, men fascinated by antiquities, myths, and oddities, gathered to analyze what evidence existed. They combed through newspaper archives, searching for past stories that might resemble the giant woman. They gathered testimonies, compared sketches, and attempted to trace the story's development over time. But their investigation suffered from the limitations of the era, inconsistent printing standards, lost records, and a culture of sensational reporting that prioritized entertainment over accuracy. They discovered that the earliest accounts were far less detailed than later retellings, suggesting that much of the story's vivid imagery had been added gradually. Yet even this revelation did not resolve the mystery. Instead, it raised new questions about who had influenced those later additions and why. Some in Charleston believed the investigation needed to be grounded in physical evidence rather than interviews and newspaper clippings. This belief led to a series of searches in buildings rumored to have housed the woman, including an abandoned home on Trad Street and an old storehouse near the docks. These expeditions were carried out discreetly, often at night, to avoid drawing crowds or attracting ridicule. Participants sometimes included city guards, merchants who owned the buildings, and occasionally physicians who had heard claims of preserved remains. They found no body, no oversized clothing, no signs of restraint or habitation, nothing tangible to support the myth. But the absence of evidence did not dispel the legend. If anything, it shifted the public imagination once again toward the idea that someone must have moved her, hidden her, or covered up the truth. The idea of a cover-up gained unexpected momentum when one newspaper published an anonymous letter claiming that the giant woman had been taken into custody by local authorities and that her existence had been concealed to prevent panic. The letter offered no proof, but its vague authority sparked speculation. Some argued it was preposterous that city officials would hide a person of such size. Others insisted that governments had concealed stranger things before. The truth was that the letter was likely a fabrication, but by the time it was debunked, it had already become part of the legend's foundation. People investigating the story found themselves trapped in circular reasoning. Any lack of evidence was considered proof of a cover-up, and any contradictory testimony was seen as evidence of deliberate misinformation. Medical professionals also entered the discussion, proposing explanations that combined curiosity with scientific speculation. A few suggested that the woman could have suffered from gigantism or a related endocrine disorder. Others wondered whether she had been part of a medical exhibition or anatomical study. These ideas were grounded in real medical phenomena, but without a body or authentic measurements, they remained hypothetical. Still, the involvement of physicians lent the story a veneer of credibility, encouraging further inquiries. Some doctors requested access to hospital records in case the woman had been treated or examined, but no such records were found. Yet again, absence of evidence was interpreted by some as further proof that something unusual had happened. Among the more determined investigators were sailors who believed the woman had arrived by ship. They searched logs and manifests, questioning crew members and captains about unusual passengers. Some recalled seeing tall individuals on earlier voyages, but none matched the specifics of the legend. A few sailors offered tales of enormous female spirits or statues they had encountered in distant lands, stories that may have been true in part, but were undoubtedly influenced by folklore. These accounts added an exotic flavor to the investigation, linking the Charleston giant woman to global myths and giving her an almost supernatural aura. Yet despite their enthusiasm, the sailors found no definitive origin in maritime records. Religious leaders also took interest, though for different reasons. Some saw the story as a moral fable, warning against gossip, fear, or superstition. Others believed the woman could have been a sign or omen. A few even suggested she was a figure of divine punishment or protection. Their involvement gave the legend a spiritual dimension, encouraging believers to search scripture or religious teachings for symbolic meaning. Churches held discussions, sermons referenced the story, and prayer groups reflected on its implications. Though these gatherings were not investigations in the traditional sense, they contributed to the collective effort to interpret the woman's purpose, adding yet another layer of complexity to the narrative. Perhaps the most systematic attempt to investigate the mystery came from a pair of young surveyors who had been inspired by the skeptical writings of early American scientists. They approached the story analytically, mapping reported sightings and attempting to identify inconsistencies in the timeline. Their notes revealed that some supposed witnesses had not even lived in Charleston at the time of the earliest reports, and that certain locations described in interviews did not exist or had been demolished years earlier. Their findings, though logical, were largely ignored by a public that preferred the intrigue of the unknown over the dull certainty of debunking. Still, their work demonstrated that a rational approach to the legend was possible, even if it failed to sway popular opinion. Inevitably, some investigations were led by those driven more by the thrill of strange stories than by any real desire for truth. Traveling storytellers, amateur ghost hunters, and self-styled explorers came to Charleston, hoping to encounter something extraordinary. They roamed cemeteries at night, searched old wells, visited plantations rumored to be haunted, and ventured into marshlands where few locals dared to go. Their findings were typically imaginative rather than factual: strange sounds, unusual footprints, eerie lights. But their sensational tales found eager audiences. These individuals helped spread the legend beyond Charleston, carrying it to surrounding towns and eventually other states. Their embellished accounts often overshadowed the original reports, exporting the mystery while further blurring its edges. Despite all these efforts, methodical, spontaneous, honest, deceptive, rational, and superstitious, no one discovered concrete evidence of the giant woman. No photographs, no official records, no physical remains, no consistent eyewitness testimony. What investigators found instead was fragmentation, conflicting stories, contradictory memories, misleading rumors, and speculation piled upon speculation. Yet the absence of definitive proof did not diminish the legend, it strengthened it. A mystery resolved loses power, a mystery that resists explanation becomes enduring. By the late 1840s, Charleston had reached an unspoken consensus. People no longer investigated the giant woman expecting answers. They investigated her to participate in the story, to reenact a shared cultural ritual. The search became a tradition, a way of engaging with the unknown, a collective performance that acknowledged both the insufficiency of logic and the necessity of imagination. The act of seeking became more important than the possibility of finding, and so the investigations ultimately revealed more about the investigators than about the woman herself. They exposed the city's anxieties, hopes, and contradictions. They showed how deeply people needed stories, stories that explained what they could not understand, that filled empty spaces in their knowledge, that allowed them to believe in something bigger than themselves. The giant woman, real or not, became a reflection of Charleston's own identity, complex, divided, searching, and endlessly shaped by the stories it chose to tell. As the decades passed, and the feverish attempts to investigate the giant woman of Charleston faded into memory, the nature of the story began to shift. No longer treated as an urgent mystery demanding a solution, it gradually evolved into something broad, and less defined, a kind of cultural artifact passed down through generations, reshaped each time it resurfaced. People stopped asking whether the giant woman existed in a literal sense, and instead began debating what her story meant. These modern interpretations, emerging slowly over time and gaining clarity as historians and researchers revisited the old accounts, would come to dominate the conversation around the legend, and in many ways they revealed far more about the people studying the mystery than about the mysterious figure herself. Much of this shift occurred because the investigations of the 1840s and 1850s produced no concrete evidence. Not a single verifiable document proved her existence, nor did any physical artifact. No footprint cast in plaster, no preserved remains, no verified sketch made by credible witnesses. As a result, later generations of historians approached the story not as a factual report, but as a lens through which to explore the psychology of earlier Charleston. They asked what the legend said about the fears, desires, and imaginations of the people who nurtured it. For many scholars, the giant woman was less a historical figure and more a cultural symbol, a projection of unresolved tensions within the city during a period of rising uncertainty. This symbolic interpretation became one of the most influential modern readings of the legend. Those leaning toward psychological interpretation argued that the giant woman represented anxiety about rapid change. Charleston in the mid-1800s was not the stable, predictable city people often remember retrospectively. It was a place experiencing waves of immigration, outbreaks of disease, economic shifts, and political disputes. The unknown, the unexpected, and the unfamiliar loomed over daily life in ways that could be felt but not always explained. In such an environment, the emergence of a story about a massive, shadowy figure hiding in the city made a certain kind of subconscious sense. She was the embodiment of the unseen forces unsettling the minds of the people. The fact that witnesses could not agree on her appearance fit perfectly with this interpretation. Fear rarely expresses itself clearly. Another branch of modern interpretation focused on the mythological framework of the story. Scholars who specialized in comparative folklore noted that tales of giants, especially female giants, appear across countless cultures. They protect sacred places, signal major societal transitions, or appear during times of upheaval. According to this view, the Charleston legend was a localized expression of a much older storytelling pattern, one carried into the American South through generational memory and retold when circumstances made people receptive to it. This interpretation suggested that the story persisted not because of factual grounding, but because it resonated with archetypal elements deeply embedded in human storytelling traditions. The lack of evidence, therefore, did not weaken the myth. It strengthened it by aligning it with universal narrative structures. Meanwhile, skeptics in the modern era approached the story with a methodical, almost forensic mindset. They dissected the newspapers of the 1840s, studying syntax, tone, and editorial habits. Their conclusion was that the story likely originated as a hoax, satire, or exaggerated report that spiraled beyond its creator's intentions. This theory connected directly to the patterns identified in the earlier investigations: inconsistent witness testimonies, the absence of original sources, and the prevalence of sensational journalism at the time. To these researchers, the giant woman was not a mysterious figure at all, but an example of how quickly misinformation can spread in a community primed for excitement. They viewed the story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unverified claims, drawing parallels between the rumors of 1843 and the viral misinformation of the modern age. Even within T. skeptical camp, however, there was disagreement. Some believed the story was purely the product of imagination, Others argued it may have begun with a real person, perhaps a tall traveler or a performer, whose appearance became distorted through retellings. This argument connected directly to the earlier theories involving misinterpretation and circus exhibitions. These scholars pointed out that eyewitness misperception remains a common phenomenon, even today. A person sees something unusual, interprets it through the lens of existing fears or rumors, and unknowingly modifies it when recounting it later. Such distortions compound as the story spreads. According to this interpretation, the giant woman may have had a real-world spark, but the spark alone was insufficient to explain the full scope of the story, which grew exponentially through human storytelling behavior. There were also researchers who approached the legend from a sociological perspective. They emphasized how the story reinforced social cohesion. Contrary to the assumption that myths divide people, these scholars argued that the giant woman may have brought Charleston together at a time when unity was desperately needed. People debated her existence, shared accounts, attended gatherings, and even organized amateur investigations. The collective engagement created a shared experience, one that helped distract from real crises and allowed people to participate in a communal narrative. Modern social scientists pointed out that similar phenomena continue today, where communities gather around unexplained events, not necessarily because they believe them to be true, but because the act of exploring them together offers emotional and psychological benefits. Still another interpretation, more unusual but surprisingly persistent, suggested that the giant woman represented suppressed or marginalized voices in Charleston's history. Some modern scholars proposed that the story might be connected symbolically to the physical and psychological presence of enslaved women in the region. The idea was not that the giant woman was such a person, but that the legend emerged from anxieties surrounding hidden suffering, overlooked humanity, and the distorted relationships between power and vulnerability in the antebellum South. In this reading, the enormous size of the woman represented not something monstrous, but something too massive to ignore, a colossal reality society preferred not to face directly. This interpretation was not universally accepted, but it demonstrated how deeply the legend could be re-examined through modern perspectives. Even the supernatural interpretation never fully died out. Modern paranormal enthusiasts, ghost hunters, and storytellers continue to speculate about the possibility that the giant woman was a spiritual entity, a residual haunting, or a manifestation of energy tied to tragedy or historical trauma. These individuals often pointed to the same details that skeptics dismissed: the inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts, the shadowy sightings at night, the absence of physical evidence. To believers in the paranormal, such traits are common in hauntings and spiritual manifestations. They even revisited the locations mentioned in earlier reports: the old warehouses, the abandoned homes, the waterfront district, using modern paranormal equipment to search for signs of unusual activity. As expected, no definitive proof emerged, but their efforts kept the supernatural version of the story alive, ensuring that the legend continued to appeal to imagination as well as intellect. Meanwhile, another modern interpretation, inspired by literary analysis, treated the giant woman as a narrative constructed by the community. Literary scholars examined how the story evolved over time, noting that it followed classic narrative arcs: mysterious origin, conflicting testimonies, failed investigations, speculation, and eventual mythologizing. They argued that the story's structure mirrored the form of Gothic fiction, popular in the 1800s, stories featuring shadowy figures, hidden secrets, mysterious women, and unsettling atmospheres. According to this theory, the giant woman legend may have been influenced by the literary tastes of the era. Newspapers and storytellers steeped in Gothic romanticism could have unconsciously shaped the narrative into something resembling the suspenseful tales they admired. In this interpretation, the giant woman was less a historical figure and more a literary construct, a character created through shared cultural aesthetics. Some researchers today prefer a hybrid interpretation, acknowledging that multiple forces likely shaped the legend. They argue that the myth was born from a combination of real-world observation, misinterpretation, cultural storytelling traditions, sensational journalism, and psychological projection. According to this synthesis, the story endured precisely because it drew strength from so many different sources. A legend with multiple roots is much harder to uproot. Each interpretation supports the next, forming a kind of interconnected web that refuses to collapse even when individual strands are broken. This hybrid view echoes the lessons from earlier investigators who found that the story seemed to expand each time they attempted to clarify it. The giant woman remained elusive because she was never one thing to begin with. Modern technology even became part of the conversation. As digital archives grew and older newspapers were scanned and catalogued, new researchers had access to documents previously unavailable. Some hoped these digital collections would finally reveal something definitive, an overlooked article, a forgotten diary, a ship manifest with a telling detail. Instead, they found what earlier investigators already knew: inconsistencies, exaggerations, and gaps. The digital age did not solve the mystery, it merely amplified its complexity by making its inconsistencies easier to see. This brings modern interpretations full circle. Scholars, enthusiasts, skeptics, and storytellers all approach the giant woman from different angles, yet all arrive at the same fundamental realization: the story's enduring power lies not in the certainty of what happened, but in the uncertainty. It is precisely because the legend lacks closure that it continues to thrive. The giant woman has become a canvas onto which each generation projects its own fears, questions, and fascinations. In that sense, she is not just a figure from the past. She is a living reflection of the culture studying her. In this way, modern interpretations connect directly to the investigations of earlier decades. Just as the amateur investigators of the 1840s and 1850s added new layers to the story, modern analysts contribute interpretations that expand the legend even further. The difference is simply one of method and context. Earlier generations searched dark warehouses, modern researchers search digital archives. Earlier witnesses described shadows, modern scholars describe symbols. Both, however, are driven by the same impulse: the desire to understand something mysterious that resists explanation. And so, the giant woman continues to hover in the space between truth and imagination, a towering figure not of flesh and bone, but of stories, questions, and interpretations. The absence of certainty, rather than diminishing the legend, ensures that she will continue to grow with every retelling. In her ambiguity, she remains as imposing as ever. The months that followed the final disappearance of the so-called giant woman brought Charleston into a strange period of uneasy quiet. It was not peace, far from it. It was the kind of silence that settles over a place only after something has disturbed its very sense of normalcy. The townspeople did not speak openly about what had happened. Most avoided the subject altogether, as if the act of naming the events might summon them back. But beneath their silence, the story churned like a tide that refused to recede, pulling stray memories and unsettled imaginations with it. It was in this atmosphere that the last threads of the mystery began to weave themselves into something resembling a final form. At least, as final as a story like this could ever be. There were no decisive answers, nothing that could be pinned to paper with authority, but there were patterns, echoes, and clues that only made sense when viewed in hindsight. And as with many unsolved events, the end of the story did not come in a dramatic revelation or confrontation, but grew slowly out of the way people changed and how the town's relationship to its own history shifted. In the weeks after the disappearance, several townspeople reported small but unsettling signs that the woman, or the presence people believed her to represent, might not be entirely gone. These signs were never as dramatic as the earlier sightings. No towering silhouette was seen stepping across fields or lingering in alleys. Instead, people described far subtler disturbances: a low vibration in the ground that could not be traced to wagons, a strange pressure in the air near the abandoned warehouse, or objects found slightly moved after a night of heavy fog. Individually, these things were insignificant, but collectively, and perhaps because the town was already primed for the uncanny, they felt like faint reminders of something that refused to vanish. Around this time, the historian who had collected the testimonies, whose careful notes now serve as one of the few semi-reliable accounts, began to experience peculiar difficulties. Pages he knew he had written vanished from his study. Some reappeared in odd places, under floorboards, between the pages of unrelated books, or tucked into the pockets of coats he had not worn in months. At first he suspected he was simply disorganized, but the pattern of these misplacements soon became too deliberate to ignore. Some pages had strange marks on them, as if something had brushed across the ink before it dried. Others appeared to have been folded and unfolded repeatedly, as though handled by someone with an unfamiliar sense of how paper should behave. He told no one of this, perhaps fearing that people would think he had become just another casualty of collective imagination. But these events pushed him into deeper inquiry, prompting him to examine not just the testimonies from Charleston, but records from other regions and eras. What he found was both extraordinary and troubling. Scattered across the centuries were reports, often buried in local folklore or dismissed as fever dreams, of figures resembling the giant woman, towering female forms that appeared during periods of social unrest, economic upheaval, or environmental change. They were described as watchers, omens, or guardians, depending on who told the story. In some accounts they were protectors, in others harbingers of disaster. But what unified these accounts was not necessarily the figure herself. It was the reaction of the communities who encountered her. Fear, awe, confusion, attempts to explain, attempts to deny, and finally a long silence that followed each appearance. This pattern seemed to replay itself in Charleston, and the historian could not shake the feeling that the woman's presence in the town might have been part of a larger recurring phenomenon that humans had never properly understood. The historian's research only deepened when he came across an obscure set of maritime logs belonging to a whaling vessel that had docked near Charleston just months before the sightings began. One of the crew members had written of encountering a massive figure in the waters off the coast, a figure that appeared to rise from the sea itself, its form vaguely human, though shimmering and indistinct in the moonlight. The sailor had described feeling an overwhelming sense of being observed, as though the ocean had produced an entity capable of judgment. When he tried to point it out to another crew member, the apparition vanished beneath the waves. This log would have been easy to dismiss as exhaustion-induced hallucination, but the timing was too close to ignore. And when paired with local accounts of the marshes behaving strangely, rising tidal pools, sudden bursts of wind, unexplained vibrations, the historian began to develop a theory that skirted the boundaries of the rational, while staying rooted in observable patterns. Perhaps the presence was neither spirit nor myth, but something connected to the land and sea themselves, something ancient, something capable of manifesting visually only under certain conditions. He never found enough evidence to prove this theory, and even in his private notes he phrased things cautiously, aware that stepping too far beyond conventional explanation risked undermining the seriousness with which he hoped people might someday treat the events. Still, his writing revealed a quiet conviction that the woman was not a literal giant, nor a ghost, nor a hallucination, but a symbol made visible, an embodiment of the region's collective anxieties and environmental shifts. The form she took was perhaps influenced by the human mind, but the presence itself might have had a physical existence beyond ordinary perception. While the historian wrestled with his theories, Charleston attempted to resume normal life. The warehouse near the swamp was eventually demolished, its rotting beams hauled away, and the foundation filled with packed earth. Some believe this act removed the last trace of whatever had unsettled the area. Yet even after the demolition, visitors described a strange sensation when passing by the site, as if the air there was slightly thicker, slightly colder, or slightly more reluctant to move. Most ignored it. A few spoke of it only in hushed tones, but the feeling persisted for years, gradually fading only as new buildings rose and the landscape changed. Over time, the story of the giant woman slipped into the realm of myth. New generations grew up hearing fragments of the tale, often exaggerated, rarely accurate. Some children believed she was a monster, others a protector. Parents discouraged them from repeating the story, though many did not know why. The unease had passed, yet the memory lingered in the town's subconscious. like an old scar that rarely aches but never fully disappears. Decades later, when the historian finally compiled his work into a manuscript, he struggled with how to end it. He had begun with the intention of documenting a strange sequence of events, but he had uncovered something far more complex. The manuscript contained detailed descriptions of testimonies, sketches, maps, comparisons to older folklore, and careful attempts at analysis. But as he wrote the final pages, he realized that no conclusion could truly resolve what had happened. The story resisted closure, as if the phenomenon itself existed beyond the boundaries of narrative. He ultimately ended the manuscript with an observation rather than an explanation. He wrote that the people of Charleston had witnessed something extraordinary, and that their responses, fear, speculation, denial, obsession, revealed as much about human nature as the phenomenon revealed about the unknown. He suggested that perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but serve instead as reminders that the world is larger and stranger than we like to believe. The manuscript was never published. Whether due to lack of interest, hesitation from publishers, or the historian's own fears that the story would be dismissed as madness, the pages remained in a small wooden chest in his home until his death. Afterward, the chest passed to distant relatives who scarcely understood the significance of its contents. For decades it sat untouched, gathering dust. It was not until the early 20th century that a curious descendant, sorting through family belongings, discovered the manuscript and recognized its potential historical value. Yet even then the story remained in obscurity, circulated only among a small circle of scholars and folklorists. Some believed it to be an embellished account of a misunderstood social phenomenon, others saw it as a critical link between regional folklore and unexplained natural events. A few dismissed it entirely. But the manuscript did something unexpected. It rekindled interest in the original sightings. Researchers began re-examining Charleston's records from 1843, newspaper archives, letters, travel journals, and a new generation of theorists emerged. Some argued that the woman had been a real flesh-and-blood person whose height had been exaggerated by fear and poor lighting. Others insisted she was a hallucination born from collective stress, and a small but growing group explored the historian's more unconventional suggestions, proposing that the sightings represented interactions with phenomena outside typical human perception. Modern analysis has not resolved the mystery any more conclusively than the historian could. But what has become clear is that the giant woman of Charleston remains one of the most intriguing unsolved enigmas in the region's history, not because of what she was, but because of what the town became during and after her appearance. The sightings forced people to confront the limits of their understanding, to question the reliability of their senses, and to consider the possibility that the world contains forces and forms that defy ordinary explanation. And yet, the most haunting aspect of the story may not be the sightings themselves, but the lingering trace of something still unsettled in the region. Even now there are occasional reports, rare, vague, easily dismissed, of people sensing a towering presence in the fog near the marshes or feeling watched in the quiet hours before dawn. These accounts are never dramatic enough to spark widespread attention, but they travel quietly among locals who have grown up hearing whispers of the past. If the presence was truly tied to the land, then perhaps it never left. Perhaps it only waits for the right conditions to be seen again. Or perhaps it exists in the space between reality and myth, shaped by the fears and curiosities of those who encounter it. Whatever the truth may be, the story of the giant woman remains open-ended, a puzzle without a final piece. And maybe that is its power. Not every mystery seeks resolution. Some exist to remind us of the vast unknown that surrounds us, the layers of reality that remain hidden, and the possibility that the world is far more alive, far more conscious, than humanity has ever fully understood. In the end, the people of Charleston moved on, but the story did not. It lives on not in the certainty of facts, but in the space where memory, imagination, and the unexplained intersect. And as long as there are those who continue to ask what truly happened in 1843, the presence, whatever it was, will never entirely fade.